Hey everyone, it's me, the Soy Pill. As we move into the second half of Hell Year 2020, the Corona lockdown seems to have eliminated America's favorite pastime, school shootings. Turns out that eliminating school is one way to stop school shootings. It's also the preferable alternative to the other obvious solution, eliminating children.
Master Skywalker, there are too many
school shootings.
What are we going to do?
But even without our bright children expressing themselves in school, gun violence in general remains a problem in America. It's by no means the worst issue, but other first world countries like Australia, Germany, Switzerland, and the UK have nowhere near the amount of gun deaths per capita that we do. This is either because they have far fewer weapons, vastly different gun laws, or fewer children employed as exterminators. In the current US climate, there exists a spectrum between two major sides of this issue. On the furthest left, you have Democrats, especially in California, calling for the banning of all guns. Then, gun legislation that bans certain types of guns, like assault weapons. Then, regulations on magazine sizes and attachments. Move further right, and you have some gun control measures like background checks. And then, on the furthest right, you have
God-given right. Don't step on shall me. Not infringe. Don't step on me!
You might expect me, a strong liberal soy boy, to advocate for the banning of all guns. However, today I'll be explaining why you, the listener, left or right, may want to own a firearm, and how we can maybe make America safer while maintaining the right to a firearm. Let's take a look at gun. What is a gun? A deadly weapon of war? A strategic and elegant tool? A means to secure a child with your wife?
Say yes.
Where did you shoot that?
Is you gonna have my baby? Say yes, or the next one gonna hit you.
If I say yes, I'm going to have
Say you
your
swear to
baby.
God.
I swear to God.
There are many different functions and aesthetics to firearms. You've got your pump action, bolt action, revolver, and semi-automatic varieties, where you pull the trigger and you get one bullet. Shorter barrels typically mean shorter range, and longer barrels mean longer range. There are different attachments that might make it easier to hold the firearm or shoot it silently. And then you have your automatics, where you pull the trigger once and if you're wondering why I'm covering this very basic gun knowledge, it's because when you ask a liberal, what is a gun? Their answer can usually be translated into something along the lines of, I have no fucking idea how a gun works or why anyone would want one. This is especially apparent when we look at the people who make the laws in our country. For example, take this California congressman. He's about to discuss legislation that would require a bullet button on certain weapons. A bullet button is a modification on the magazine release that requires a small pin or a bullet to press. It's a pro-gun control law that's meant to slow down reloading and potentially delay a mass shooter. This man thinks a bullet button makes your gun automatic.
If you read again the information in here, the bullet gun, if you look and who actually need an automatic weapon to be able to put a pin in it and make it a fully automatic weapon to continue to shoot rounds that's going to have mass destruction. Who would actually need that particular weapon?
Or how about this lawmaker who thinks that incendiary rounds make bullets heat-seeking?
But some of these bullets, as you saw, have an incendiary device on the tip of it, which is a heat-seeking device. So you don't shoot deer with a bullet that size. If you do, you could cook it at the same time.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a baby skull-seeking bullet. Yep. This bullet, once fired out of a weapon, immediately targets the nearest baby's skull and
Or this lawmaker, who doesn't know the terminology in her own bill, and even makes Tucker Carlson look clever. A man who always looks like he's taking a test that he didn't study for.
In February, you introduced the Assault Weapons Ban and Law Enforcement Protection Act of 2007. It would regulate semi-automatic assault weapons, including weapons that have pistol grips, a forward grip, and something called a barrel shroud. Weapons with a barrel shroud would be regulated. What's a barrel shroud, and why should we regulate it?
I think the more important thing is that it also would have had banned the large capacity clips.
What's a barrel shroud, and why should we regulate that?
The guns that were chosen back in those days were basically the guns that most gangs and criminals were using to kill our police officers. The best bill they could get out at that particular time. I actually don't know what a barrel shot is.
These lawmakers are in the same vein as the anti-abortion people who know absolutely nothing about how a woman's body functions and yet are writing legislation on abortion. Democrats could win so many more people over if they showed even the slightest understanding of guns and the motivations of gun owners. So, now that we've covered the basics of guns, before we can talk policy, we have to understand why someone would want a gun. After doing extensive internet research, I've boiled down the answer to 3 major reasons. Reason number 1, they're fun. Most liberals I've talked to have never shot a gun, so they wouldn't know how much fun this is. Or this.
Oh!
These activities are exhilarating and safe, given that the person doing them is responsible. But in the face of gun violence, you might ask whether one's personal fun is worth the damage to the country that accompanies it. I would gladly give up watching my wife have sex with strangers if it would somehow prevent thousands of deaths per year. Now, I want this to be absolutely clear to the conservatives and other gun owners in the audience. I'm not saying it's not okay to enjoy firearms. I enjoy them, you enjoy them, and you are valid for enjoying yourself. Mwah. Reason number 2, self-defense. 66% of firearm owners cite self-defense as the reason for owning a firearm. However, the statistics on defensive gun uses, or DGUs, vary wildly. One famous study from however the fuck you pronounce these names estimates 2.1 million DGUs per year. But many in the academic community call their survey methodology into question. Conservative estimates are as low as 55,000 to 80,000 DGUs per year. So for argument's sake, let's just take this conservative estimate of 55,000. 55,000 is a pretty significant amount of people who were able to defend themselves with a firearm. To get more insight, we have to also look at the firearm deaths per year. Looks like I'm gonna need my fact gator on this one.
Oh yeah, it's me, the fact gator. Oh yeah, in 2017, gun deaths reached their highest level since 1968, with 39,773 deaths by firearm, of which 23,854 were by suicide and 14,542 were homicides. Oh yeah.
With these numbers in mind, the question becomes one of personal safety and moral consideration on the worth of life. Are 55,000 prevented crimes worth the almost 40,000 deaths, considering some of those failed crimes are theft rather than rape or murder?
Oh yeah, what about cars?
What about cars, fact gator?
Oh yeah! In 2017, there were a total of 34,247 car crashes involving fatalities on U.S. roads. A very comparable number to the 39,773 gun deaths in 2017. Oh yeah!
You're right, Fact Gator. We do get a comparable amount of deaths from cars as we do firearms. Although, to be fair, it's worth noting that cars are an integral part of our society and much more common than firearms. The point is, we as a society deem these deaths acceptable for cars, as we have yet to get rid of cars. We of course are always trying to make cars safer, and we'll cover gun safety later in the video. Many would argue that, yes, the right to protect one's life, property, and family supersedes the detriment to society caused by criminals and irresponsible gun owners, especially if you're someone who used a firearm to save themselves from a violent crime or otherwise. It's pretty unfair to suggest that society's mishandling of firearms in general should be cause for you to become unsafe.
44 Magnum can shoot in single action. That's like trigger pull.
Did you mean to do that?
Yeah.
Speaking of killing yourself, suicides are a large majority of the total gun deaths per year. Some people on the pro-gun side use this high suicide number as a way to diminish the severity of gun deaths in America. But these suicides are directly tied to the fact that suicide by gun is one of the most effective ways of killing yourself. Studies show that many people regret their failed suicide attempts, but no one regrets a successful one. And while it's still technically possible to survive a gunshot to the head, head, you're far more likely to survive something like a pill overdose. The problem is, a lot of gun legislation being pushed in Congress wouldn't prevent these suicides. Banning assault weapons or silencers won't stop a gun from being an efficient method of suicide, unless you're a close political friend of Hillary Clinton. But what about the people who want to get rid of all guns? Theoretically, if firearms weren't so easily accessible, the suicide number would go way down. And for self-defense, we have the police for reason 2.5. The police. A lot of my liberal friends tell me only the police should need firearms. Or, to quote my former French coworker, "Why don't Americans simply call the police and hide in the closet?" Well, police response time on average is 11 minutes. If someone's in your house and you call the police, unless you've booby-trapped it Home Alone style, or you live in the middle of a hedge maze, chances are the police won't get there before the intruder gets to you. Only 7.2% of break-ins resulted in a homeowner becoming the victim of a violent crime, but no one wants to be in that 7.2%. American gun owners have the drive to be self-reliant and understand the shortcomings of American law enforcement when it comes to protection. Speaking of police shortcomings, reason number 3, tyrannical government. This argument sort of supersedes all of the other ones. Even if there were no self-defense cases and no one had fun with guns, wanting a gun for the contingency that a tyrannical government may one day turn on its populace is a good enough reason in and of itself. This can be on a small scale, like police misconduct and brutality, to large-scale things, like a fascist government. In 2020, the murder of George Floyd set off a chain of anti-police brutality protests across the country. In a moment of clarity, the police took immediate action to reform themselves, putting in place several checks and balances and nah, just kidding, they just started wailing on people. In the age of cell phones, it's now impossible to hide the countless examples of law enforcement abusing their position of power. Now I know what you're thinking. Is the soy pill suggesting that protesters open fire on violent officers? In a glorious Wild West shootout between the American masses and the police, destroying the fabric of society until eventually the powers that be can't control the outbreak of civilian shootings and use nuclear weapons on its own populace, setting us into a nuclear winter and finally allowing the soy pill to live out his post-apocalyptic fantasy in a Fallout-style wasteland? No, I don't think we should do that. But civilians with guns have used them successfully in the past to keep the police in check. For example, in the 60s, the Black Panthers would use their firearms, much like many countries use nukes as deterrence. They would follow around police cars in Oakland, legally open carrying. When the cops would make an arrest, the Black Panthers would wait at a distance and stand there, menacingly, to make sure the cops didn't brutalize their suspects. Allegedly, this resulted in zero violence between the two groups. There was obviously violence between the police and the Black Panthers, but none documented for this specific policing the police practice. It also led to then Governor Ronald Reagan and the NRA to ban open carrying in California. While I'm not sure to what extent policing the police would be viable in the modern age, we can at least see that it's possible to do with firearms. Most liberals don't buy into the fighting a tyrannical government argument. Your small weapons or AR-15s won't do anything against the US government. You're not trained, they have tanks and bombs, drones, and nukes. It's a pretty rock-solid argument, since as far as I know, no technologically inferior force has ever been able to defeat a nuclear-powered US at the height of their military power. Wait, what's that sound coming from? Vietnam, where boys became men, and rice farmers became as effective as the global superpower. Now, to paint the whole picture, I have to acknowledge the fact that Vietnam was being assisted by the USSR and China, among other countries. But the point is that with vastly inferior technology and manpower, and relying on ambushes, stealth, and other guerrilla tactics, the Vietnamese successfully drove out the most powerful military in the world.
Nice try, GI!
A tyrannical action on the US people by its own government would not look like some 1770s conventional war where two armies charge at each other on a battlefield. It's why, despite being the biggest and most well-funded military on the planet, the US has trouble winning wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're not fighting an army on an open field, and they don't want to wipe out the whole population.
Are you sure about that?
If the US government were to turn on its own population full force, it would go something like those wars, where political resistors, however unorganized, are mixed in with the civilian non-combatant population. But more likely than some total war on most civilians is a fascist government that implements certain controls on its citizens and rounds up political dissidents into camps. Something like what's happening right now with the Uyghur Muslims in China. Now, it's true that even if armed, the Uyghur minority in China wouldn't be able to fight off the entire CCP. They would be more like French resistance groups in World War II, not laying over and letting themselves be taken, but causing internal struggles that aid in hopefully an overall movement against the tyranny, supported by outside countries or otherwise. On a small side note, pretty much the sole reason that a country like Switzerland arms its own populace is because of fear of foreign invasion. So even if you aren't worried that America could turn fascist on its own citizens, disclaimer, if you're a liberal and complaining about President Trump's overreach, but somehow don't think that the American government could turn fascist, please slap yourself in your stupid liberal face. Trump is declaring non-unified political ideologies as terrorist groups, and using Nazi iconography to label his political opponents, and tweeting out pictures of protesters to his millions of followers to be rounded up and arrested, and tweeted out a video of people shouting white power, and has secret police in Portland rounding up political dissidents. Hey, it's me, the soy pill, editing this video. So every time I finish this list, Trump keeps doing like a new fascist thing. Like he recently started talking about delaying the election, and then he started dismantling the post office so people wouldn't do mail-in ballots, even though a bunch of states already have 100% mail-in ballots with no problems. And then he talked about having a third term again. So this list is just gonna keep growing, and I want this video to come out, so by the time you're watching this, assume the list has grown by like 30 new reasons, and maybe buy a gun, just in case. As I was saying, a foreign invasion could be just as much an existential threat to you as a domestic takeover. And just in case you think the United States government wouldn't overturn democracy for its own interests, let me introduce you to Anyway, all I'm saying is, if you have a resist sign in your front lawn but not a firearm, you're fucking stupid. Before we move on to policy on making guns safer, I want to give a quick shout out to all the other reasons you could own a gun that I don't give a shit about, like hunting, sport shooting, weddings, and all the other things that fall into the category of fun but aren't super valid reasons when talking about gun violence. So, now that we know why someone would want a gun, and hopefully accept that at least one of those reasons is valid, let's move on to the problem at hand. There is too much gun violence in America, between mass shootings, general gun deaths, suicides, and accidents. So, what do we do to let people have their guns for one of the aforementioned reasons, but make them safer for the whole country? There's no way that America will ever ban all guns, even though banning all guns could eventually lead to a near total halt on gun violence and mass shootings. This is evident in pretty much any country with strict gun laws. Some people like to say that knife crime and car crime would replace guns if guns were taken away. But that's a bunch of bullshit. Usually a knife begins to get dull after about the 12th child, and my white unmarked van can't fit through the hallways of an elementary school. I know conservatives like to look at places with strict gun laws like California or Chicago and point out that they don't work, as there's clearly still a large amount of gun crime in both states. What's often overlooked is that even though access is limited in these states, it's not limited in the states adjacent to them. For example, in Chicago, you need a permit and a waiting period for a firearm. However, they can buy guns in Wisconsin or Indiana and illegally bring them over to Chicago. Unless these two states, and eventually the whole country, implements the same strict laws, they won't be nearly as effective in Chicago. But advocating for the banning of all firearms to stop gun violence is like advocating absolute abstinence-only education to stop teen pregnancy. Theoretically, you're right, but Americans want to shoot their load, so it's time to get realistic. A significant portion of the population will always want guns, be it for self-defense, fear of a tyrannical government, or any other reason. Liberals have to come to terms with the fact that guns are here to stay in some shape or form. And, accepting that reality, liberals and gun owners alike can push for these policies. Number 1. Advocate for better training. Most gun owners follow the 4 unwritten rules of gun safety. Number 1. Always treat the gun like it's loaded. Number 2. Take your finger off the trigger until you're ready to fire. Number 3. Only point it at what you intend to shoot. And number 4. Know what your target is and what's behind your target. These sort of things should be common knowledge for any firearm owner. Clearly, they're not.
Whatever. Taxation is theft. Oh! God damn it, motherfucker!
Gun training could be very similar to the training one needs to get a driver's license. One would take a theoretical and practical test on gun safety, and maybe some lessons on the range with an officer. Better training won't necessarily reduce the number of gun deaths that much, but it will keep you personally safer and potentially allow you to bullseye a predator drone while standing in the back of your Toyota Tacoma. Training will mean people are more responsible with their firearms, causing less accidents, storing them properly and making them harder to steal, and not selling them to unqualified people. Number 2. Expand background checks. When purchasing from a gun store, they'll run a background check to find any felonies or domestic abuse charges or any other thing that would stop you from buying a gun.
Oh yeah, it's me, the Fact-Gator. 25% of criminals who are in jail for a firearm-related crime acquired their firearm from a friend or family member. 40% of all sales are private. Oh yeah!
Look, I'm all for buying little Billy his first Glock on Christmas, but these purchases between friends and families need background checks too. Bob might be your friend, but he also might wail on his wife for using light mayo in the potato salad. Based on my tyrannical government argument earlier, you would correctly infer that I'm against universal background checks. I don't want a database of every gun owner in America in the hands of the federal government. You know, just in case. But there still needs to be more background checks.
But what do we do about mass shootings?
Since no one wants to get rid of children, and schools should be coming back in the near future, what can we do to stop school shootings and other similar domestic terror attacks? First of all, we have to define mass shootings. When you see a statistic early in the year that says, there have been 300 mass shootings in the first 5 months of 2020, this is referring to any firearm incident where 4 or more people were killed. This, of course, isn't good, unless it was in a Denny's, but it's distinct from the mass shootings that we're used to seeing in the media, where someone publicly is trying to murder as many people as possible. Now, luckily, mass shootings account for a very small amount of the gun deaths per year, only 2%. Really, they shouldn't be happening at all, and the other problem is the fear that, even though you kept little Billy out of the Bloods and the Crips, he could still get shot at school because he stole a crayon from the problem child. And while gun violence and violence in general has been on the decline in America, since 2011, mass shootings have been on the rise. Access to guns may be the reason these shootings are allowed to happen, as most mass shooters obtain their firearms legally. But the availability of the firearms doesn't explain the spike in mass shootings, because that didn't significantly change. Again, I want to make it clear that if we got rid of all guns, these mass shootings would probably stop. But since the gun owners of this country will never allow you to take their ability to defend themselves, we need to meet somewhere in the middle. Therefore, it's time to make my final appeal to the conservatives, who've stuck around and watched me shit on liberals for this many minutes. Alright, conservatives, you're on board for gun rights. You agree a lot of gun legislation is dumb, but you care about your country and you want to see violence and mass shootings stop. Well, a lot of what would likely fix gun deaths is actually adjacent to gun legislation. About 60% of gun deaths are suicides. We need better and cheaper healthcare and mental health programs. People need access to the therapy and counseling that today most people don't have. Expanding America's healthcare would also hopefully address mass shootings to a large extent. The only real alternative I see to universal healthcare is universal mandated firearms. Then we could at least save money on healthcare, since statistically a good chunk of the population would kill themselves with their government mandated firearm. On top of this, we need to do something about the average quality of life in America. Increasing spending power, lifting people out of poverty, and eliminating heavy heavy wealth disparity would get rid of reasons to commit suicide. This goes for the homicides too. Violence involving firearms drastically decreases as people get out of poverty. We can eliminate the need for crime and violence with affordable housing, increased minimum wage, and other populist policies. Stop backing the NRA. The NRA does not support gun rights and gun owners. They support the gun manufacturers who give them money. Remember the open carrying Black Panthers I talked about earlier? The NRA was part of the huge push to get their open carry rights taken away. They took gun rights from every Californian because they were scared of black people exercising them. 74% of NRA members and 87% of non-NRA gun owners support requiring criminal background checks on all gun buyers. 71% of NRA members support barring people on terror watch lists from buying guns. And 64% of NRA members believe that the law should require gun owners to alert police to lost and stolen guns. Despite all of this, the NRA policymakers oppose these proposals. Look, if you're worried about the government taking too much ground, buy a gun, stop worrying, and take the ground back later if you have to. And Democrats, help out these conservatives. If they're making the effort to try to support these policies, don't nominate candidates that pass dumb gun legislation. Elect gun-savvy Democrats that know what they're talking about, and want more common-sense things like background checks and training. I know this isn't the big, easy solution that many people would hope for, but it's the hard truth. If we aren't going to get rid of guns altogether, and justifiably so, we have to attack the problem from the flanks. If we have a populace who is trained, has access to therapy and healthcare, and has an overall better quality of life, it's going to result in far fewer accidents, suicides, homicides, and mass shootings. Keep your guns and vote for populist policies. Make guns a staple of the left wing in America. Or sit by idly as either Republicans do nothing and people keep dying, or Democrats take all your guns away. Clock's ticking. Thanks for watching. Please leave a like if you did, subscribe if you're not already, and let me know if I changed your mind, or there's another crazy position you want me to cover, left or right. Check the description for my wife's phone number. And as always, chill. Take the soy pill.